Hello and welcome to this, the 8th video in my series on absurdities in science. In previous videos I've been expounding my belief that human cognition conspires with memory to project delusions onto what we observe in the world. We then use familiar regularities from the feedback to make sense of that world. Language is a case in point, namely the words we use to describe the world. We treat words as if they have meaning, and of course, through familiarity, through habit, words do acquire meaning. However, words are where confusion begins, not where it ends. They cover up confusion. They are the place where questioning stops so that communication and action can begin. Humpty Dumpty summed it up. Well, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Every word is prejudice. There can be no definition of any word except as a delusion. Consequently, a dictionary is a magical document that only convinces us that we can define words. However, nothing is defined there. We just think it is. Such is the Dictionary Fallacy. Using the dictionary as a recursive stack, words are defined in terms of other words. Big fleas having little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. Where do we stop this explosive recurring sequence? There is no set of absolute and fundamental words to terminate the potentially infinite recursion. Instead, we choose to stop when the totality of descriptions at hand are given in terms of words we think we understand. But do we really understand? Just try finding applicable definitions of a and the without using the words a and the. Not to mention all the absurdities wrapped up in the concepts of sameness and similarity that are involved here. You can see my videos 1 and 2 for a discussion of those two particular sinners. The infinite regression must somehow be halted. We must stop at some point, and beyond that we do not question. Then, as long as we delude ourselves into thinking we understand the meaning, we can slice right across the paralysis and just get on with it. Operating in this way, day in, day out, after a certain point it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to realize that the constitution of language itself, like any other system, is self-referential. The emergent phenomenon we call meaning stands before an unquestioned consequence of the combinations of words. The necessary and concomitant asymmetry created in that combination is lost and forgotten. Ultimately, humanity has reached the greatest self-delusion of them all. We don't recognize the delusions as delusions. They are the truth, and there is a utility in being tricked, convinced in this way. What convinces us is not necessarily true, it is merely convincing. We have to be convinced of what we perceive in order to act, in order to make our way in the world, both as an individual and as part of a group. However, we are limited by the way we think. Our convictions may enable us to operate in the world, but it also restricts us in how we do it. For our world is unknowable, yet variously interpretable. There is no one meaning behind it, rather a myriad of imposed meanings, each a more or less internally consistent form, although not necessarily mutually consistent with all the others. The delusions themselves are products of a continuing process of bootstrapping out of what is familiar in past experience, and thus previously accepted. We daren't question these beliefs too closely, for then cracks will appear, and the delusions will no longer have the power to convince. However, when we accept absurdities as part of this sense-making, eventually they will pop up as paradoxes and inconsistencies. For each of us, our lives are a never-ending, re-entrant feedback loop of developing delusions. To be convincing, each dominant and thus accepted delusion must ultimately deny other competing, contradictory delusions. In this way, we can sidestep any absurdities that these alternatives will inevitably point out. We are able to convince ourselves that we are making sense of the world. And in making sense, we are being sensible. On each trip around this developmental loop, in order for the delusions to remain convincing, problems must be avoided with a mix of the requisite denials and supported by the creation of ever more sophisticated variations of the original ideas. Not always that convincing. We have all been in a position where our certainties have been aggressively questioned by others, and in defense we often resort to the most absurd, convoluted, and warped self-deceptions. Of course, such variations must be based on comparisons with what is familiar, but these too will have their own absurdities. This is the process that Nietzsche called refined ignorance. Now, quite reasonably, you should be asking me what happens when this analysis is levelled at the view I am expressing here. What delusions am I using in my description of thought and delusion? To answer that, let me resort to a metaphor proposed first by Plato, who portrayed human interpretations of this world as a community living in a cave. They observe flickering shadows from the real world of phenomena, projected onto the cave wall. The big question is whether an enlightened individual can go out of the cave into the sunshine and see the marvel that is reality. Or are we all fated to see only vain shadows, distorted projections? My personal and skeptical position is unequivocal. As individuals, we are trapped inside a cave of private sensory experience, an unfathomable labyrinth of delusions. Our heads are the cave, and the shadows are the projections of our sense data. All we perceive are the shadows on Plato's wall, and not the things in themselves that are casting the shadows. We delude ourselves into believing that these shadows are an exact emulation of what is happening outside. But there is no going outside of cognition and directly accessing reality. For better or worse, we are trapped inside the confines of our consciousness. Shadows thrown out by the sparks of cognition bounce around self-referentially. Cognition convinces us that its interpretation is reality, and we use it so we can adjust our actions to fit in effectively with our experience of circumstance. Of course, there are inconsistencies in my use of this metaphor, but then you just have to deny them like I do and move on. From my perspective, the notion of objective truth is a form of tautology, a suitably falsified world of refined ignorance, a mere consistency within a system of continuing self-reference. There is no true or false, nor right or wrong way. We must rely on delusional interpretations of perceived phenomena within the reflexive constraints of systematizing causal delusions. Naturally, the occasional appearance of inconsistencies must be ignored. These delusions convince ourselves and others of the utility and thus the rationality of our analysis. In terms of survival and natural selection, all that matters is not whether such interpretations are true, only that they are appropriate for purpose. Human observation does not give us access to a real world. Observation is deceived by a tidy linearity inferred within the notion of causality. We humans do not observe cause and effect in the world. Instead, a belief in causality is a necessary prerequisite of observation and cognition. Indeed, without the delusion of causality, there would be no observation. Observation and cognition are only possible because linearity is erroneously imposed on what is always and already a complex, non-linear world. And you will notice that in my assertion that observation and cognition are only possible because, indeed when I make any assertion, I too must resort to causality. Because, here I go again, because, like all humans, I am trapped and limited by the linearity in my thinking. I repeat, my position is that there is no causality in the world. Causality is all in our heads. The world does not operate causally according to the laws of nature. Let us beware of saying there are laws in nature. There are only necessities. There is no one to command, no one to obey, no one to transgress. But what happens in the world is not arbitrary, although that having been said, the world does not operate because of anything. It is as it is, what it will become. Necessarily so, whatever that may or may not be. We humans simply stumble around in that world, thankfully with the capacity to project order onto it. Then we fish out regularities, but with numerous interpretations at various levels of sophistication, although all are restricted by linear thinking. Causality is a blunt instrument that convinces us of the validity of our interpretive descriptions of what is necessarily so. This is hardly surprising, since causality is part of the self-reinforcing argumentation that we have come to call intelligence, and which convinces us that we exist in a totally accessible reality. Causality, be it in a mathematical or any other form, is merely a means of description and the basis of questioning, but one that itself cannot be questioned. Welcome to the continuous, self-convincing merry-go-round of the human condition. Now, if these arguments intrigue you, then for a more elaborate treatise, you will have to read Science's First Mistake, the book I wrote with my good friend Dionysius Demetis. A free download can be found on our website, www.sciencesfirstmistake.com. Thank you.